して、大利賀と申します。今年、京都精華大学の大学院漫画研究科を卒業しました。今までこの京都で3年間を過ごして、ずっと岩骨王というアニメとそのメディアミックスを研究してきましたが、で今日も実はあまり私の発表は残念ながらロシア製の漫画と直接に関係を持たずに、その代わりに岩骨王モンテクリスト箱の漫画へのアダプテーションを中心にします。でちょっと長くなりそうですから、ぜひ楽しくお聞きください。Yes, it will be in English. I wanted to make a brief introduction in Japanese as well, but yes, today, unfortunately, I'm not going to talk about Russian-made, Russian-produced manga directly. Instead, I'm going to talk about adaptation of the Count of Monte Cristo novel the manga. All 5 of them are now, all right. So the novel itself hardly needs any introduction. I guess just brief information. It was first serialized in 1844 and 1846 in France, and it was an instant success, and even now it remains one of the most famous revenge stories of all kinds. Therefore, it has been adapted time and again into movies, into TV series, into graphic novels, into musicals, and so on. In fact, even when it first arrived in Japan, it was in a form of adaptation by Kuraiwa Ruiko, who transformed the narrative quite a bit, and the only full translation was made only much later by Yamanouchi Yoshio. But nevertheless, the novel proved quite popular in Japan as well, and therefore it was again repeatedly adapted into manga. Here you have 5 titles I have found so far, all of them adapted in various ways. Some of them are pretty close to the original text, as for example, the second one by Tsukikage Ken and Kubota Sentaro, or the 4th one by Muriyama Emma. While some of them, like the 3rd one, for example, or the last one, transform the source text quite a bit. In fact, they're completely different narratives, I would say. But today, I don't want to talk about the contents of the novels or about the stories. Instead, I want to talk about narrative convention, about narrative and expressive conventions, about the narrating techniques and expressive techniques that are used in this manga, and about evolution of those. Because as is quite clear, all these adaptations were not only shaped by the creator's tastes or interpretations, nor by the format, but also by the changing trends in the history of manga. So to explain these trends, I would like to refer to the theoretical framework provided by Ito Go in his seminal book Tezuka is Dead, which is already 10 years old, but it's quite well known among Japanese researchers. And it's quite well known because Ito was quite novel for his time. He proposed a new approach to the medium. He wanted to develop a new kind of criticism regarding manga. So what did he do to provide a new vantage point on manga? Well, he addressed the so-called kairaku, the pleasure of engaging with manga. Ito asked, how do we enjoy manga? And for him, the answer was because of characters. We enjoy manga because we bond emotionally with characters, we empathize with them. But in order to bond emotionally with a character, we have to first to perceive it as worth bonding with. We have to perceive its reality. So this was the crucial point of Ito's argument, because reality of characters can take different forms, because characters of the manga, characters themselves have a dual nature. First of all, we have so-called character, or a character in a traditional sense of the word. So it is a figurant of a story with evident interiority, name, and personality, who inhabits a fictional universe of a sort. So we perceive it as a living being, and we relate to it. On the other hand, every manga character is built on the basis of so-called proto-character, or kara. And this term is very important. It was specifically coined by Ito, well, in order to explain all his point of view on the characters. So for Ito, kara is based on a simple drawing of a creature that in first personality has a personal name and which appears repeatedly across the narrative text or texts, thus creating a sense of continuity. And kara, as distinct from character, you see, they don't have depth or personality, not necessarily, but they have the sense of presence, of realness, so-called actuality. In Japanese it's genzensei, which might be just a little bit clear. And of course there is no so-called clear-cut distinction between the two of them. So we cannot say, for example, these are karas and these are characters. Each character in a fiction, in a work of fiction, actually has both aspects, but in different proportions. And of course, both evoke a sense of real in the reader, and thus call forth an emotional response, the bonding. However, again, this realness is different. The realness of the character depends on the plausibility and possibility, so-called motomorashisa. So we look at character and we think, oh, it's just like in the real life. It has real life problems, it has real life personality, it's just like a living person, like one of us. I can relate to him, to her. However, the realness of kara resides on a sheer sense of presence and in its ability to evoke strong feelings in the reader or in the viewer. This is why karas don't even need narratives to produce this emotional effect. And the clearest example is, of course, more elements introduced by Azuma Hiroki, who wrote quite extensively about them. You look at this kara possessing more elements like a haircut, certain type of eyes, a certain type of clothes, and you just react. I'm pretty sure that if anyone here has ever enjoyed manga or anime or otaku culture, they can relate to this. So, why are these two aspects of character crucial for Ito's argument? Well, because from Ito's point of view, they help outline the changes that occurred in Japanese manga from 1920s to 1990s, and especially from 1940s to 1990s. Basically, they help to explain this distinction in the history of manga into modernity and postmodernity. So, the essential point is that modernity in manga, which started in the late 1940s with this work by Tezuka, The Mysterious Underground Man, it corresponds to the suppression of kara and with the emphasis on character, which means that because character has to be developed through a narrative, it also means that narrative is emphasized, narrating techniques are emphasized, and the higher levels of reality become the aim of producers and also of the critics. On the other hand, what we find after 1980s is the resurface of kara. So the simple drawings, moe elements become important again, and also kara gets separated from the story. They become isolated. They just start traversing narratives. We find this proliferation of doujinshi, for example, and so on. And this means postmodernity in manga. And as the status and relevance of characters and narrative in the story manga changed, so did the medium itself. And finally, I'm getting to the main point of my presentation. It means that different renditions of The Count of Monte Cristo, for example, which were produced from 1969 to 2015, they also reflect these transformations on the level of medium. And particularly revealing in this regard are, well, here on the list, are character design, page layout, hatching, quality of lines and hatching and screen tones. At the same time, of course, certain trends can also be traced on the level of contents and narrative structure, but I don't even hope that I will be able to speak about all of these about all the 4 points, so of course we'll have to omit narrative structure for today. So let's proceed to our first main point of difference, which is character design. Well, it will be too simplistic to say that, for example, characters are always sophisticated and they are drawn in a complicated ways, while characters are primitively drawn. No, this is not the case, but as you can see even from these examples, characters tend to be very stylized, very codified, not very realistic, because they aim at abstract. While with the character, you find the opposite tendency. So there is this people strive to get heightened plausibility, and so get more and more realistic, which you, for example, see in the first 2 titles, first 2 adaptations of The Count of Monte Cristo, one of them produced in 1969 and the other in 1979. First, I would like you to have a look at the Chronicle of Revenge, the older one, which is clearly still in transition between Tezuka's round, cute style and realistic style of Gekiga. So characters, for example, you can see that there are still these distorted proportions, there is still stylized expressions, exaggerated expressions, but also you might notice that these are not typical manga-like expressions. They are closer to cartoons from, for example, in newspapers. So then there is this shift we find in this second title, which was produced 10 years later. And here you find that just this perfect example of Gekiga realism. So they really, it's almost photorealistic at times. And even, for example, when you see some dramatic moments or funny moments and some distorted expressions, they still remain very, very close to real life. However, this is not the case with the titles created after 2000. Here you actually find the opposite tendency. They all contain manga lexicon of gestures and expressions that are probably familiar to anyone, to any contemporary reader. Sorry. And the most typical of them is probably the third version, the fourth adaptation of The Count of Monte Cristo by Murayama Ena, here on the screen. Just look at these faces, you have seen them somewhere surely. However, the most interesting case is Kumagai Kazuhiro's Monte Cristo, the last one, which is interesting because it combines very typical moe female characters with exaggerated and cartoonish male characters, which are actually closer to early post-war manga. So you see, male characters are also not very, well, contemporary manga-like. So Kumagai, in other words, switches between modes very easily, between levels of stylization, even within his single work. And Maeda and Murayama, while they're more consistent in their respective styles, they still don't aim for realism at all. So the second aspect I would like to draw your attention to is the quality of lines. And it is well known that Gekiga creators developed an entirely new type of line by G-Pen in order to break away from, is it even visible? In order to break away from Tezuka's round, cute lines and to aim for a raw, living effect in their drawings. So here, for example, are typical round, neat lines by Tezuka. And here what we have in Gekiga. We might want to ask these questions. So, okay, Kara possesses this sense of reality, of physical presence, and lines in Gekiga also possess this sense of physical presence. So, what's the difference? But there is difference because actually, again, we have two different types of presence. In Gekiga, you have this effect of living body. So it's a body where blood flows, it's a body that can be tainted probably, it's a body that can hurt probably. But in case of, for example, Tezuka's lines, again, you have the sense of presence, but this Kara produces still more abstract. it's closer to, well, Mickey Mouse, Pikachu. We are not entirely sure if they can bleed. They probably can, especially in some renditions by fans, but not by definition, no. So Gekiga introduced these types of very bold, very expressive lines, but then again, after the 80s, the Gekiga has subsided, and clean and non-organic lines regained popularity. So it actually coincided with the emergence of Kara. So in all three titles that were produced after 2000, we again find these clean, crisp, clear lines. But again, they are quite different from each other. For example, look at Mahiro Maeda's Ganbutsuo. Maeda also uses clear lines, but he also uses very sketchy style with seemingly random strokes, open contours, and also conspicuous hatching. So it still has some level of organic within it. Look, for example, to the contrast again at lines by Kumagai, which are very even, solid, brittle, and they are non-organic at all. Also, hatching is absent, you might notice. And this is another aspect I want to point at in my presentation, the balance between hatching and between screen tones. So let's talk about screen tone for a bit. So screen toning is very important in the history of manga because, as Natsume Kusanowski argues, it was revolutionary. Why was it revolutionary? Because it allowed to create very complicated optical effects, such as play of light and shadow. For example, drawing transparent water and such. And before screen tones came into wide use in 1970s, Gekiga artists and such tried to reproduce the same effects by cross-hatching. And you can look at an example, for example, by Mizuki Shigeru. So it's very realistic, and it's very convincing, but it's also very dark and crowded, so to say, and quite heavy. So it's interesting that Natsume, for example, identifies it as not very manga-like, at least not manga-like as we know manga today. Screen tones solve this problem, but also quite soon, manga artists found another use for screen tone as expressive means. You could produce quite heightened reality effects using screen tones, but you could also actually raise the level of abstraction, as you can see on this example, for example. So you replace hatching and you replace background sometimes by screen tones. It all becomes quite flat, quite non-organic again, quite abstract. The use of screen tones coincided somehow with the whole with the development of medium on the whole. So again, in the earliest adaptation of Monte Cristo, you find very detailed panels almost covered with hatching, with the aim again of reproducing realistic landscapes, for example, realistic views. And in its successor, which was produced 10 years later, already screen tones are used, but again, with the aim to create photorealism. Like here, for example. However, when you look at screen tones again in manga adaptations of Monte Cristo produced after 2000, there is this entire state of affairs entirely. For example, look again at Maeda's version. Maeda Makiro switches very freely within his work between heavily screen-toned pages and pages that are covered with hatching, like this, and especially this. And you see even here that it can produce quite a crumpled, dark impression, but also it somehow makes it closer to the earlier Gekiga. And on the other hand, we have a work adaptation by Kumagai, who, as I said before, discards hatching entirely and uses just screen tones. Well, it's just a little bit, just a little bit more. And it goes even to the extent that he replaces speed lights with screen tones. And the effect changes accordingly. For example, when I demonstrated these examples in Seika to Seika university students who, as you know, deal with manga first-handedly, many of them. For most of them, it wasn't pleasant. They emphasized the impression of flatness and also of inorganic digital look. And so, I'm already past my time.
Потихоньку заканчивать, пожалуйста. Ну, то есть, ну, у вас еще осталось. Давайте скажем, 2 минуты осталось.
All right. So the last point I wanted to cover was the page layout, and it was also quite an interesting theory by Ito Go about indeterminacy of frame. So frame, you can imagine a picture frame, for example. So frame, from Ito's point of view, actually can be interpreted in two ways. First of all, it's a frame around a picture about a panel or a page. It's like a window in a fictional world. So as a window, it can refer both to the page and to the panel. And also, frame can be interpreted as a film frame, as a snapshot taken by camera, and as such, it can refer only to a panel. Thus, the indeterminacy of frame, so it can be attributed to both. So Ito actually tried to explain through indeterminacy of frame how different manga genres develop, because you have shoujo and shonen, for example, as well as seinen and gekiga. And all in all, manga produced for male readership aimed at cinematic effects. And for that, they chose to, to identify frame as a panel, and then to just treat manga as if they were filming things through camera. So you have cinematic effects, you have very clear transitions between panels, you have very clear layouts, and also, of course, the goal was the transparency of medium. So ideally, you just read, you don't pay attention to how panels are broken down, to the breakdown of a page, you just go mostly towards the end of the narrative. While, and as you can see, again, in the examples from different Monte Cristo adaptations, that was very much the case with the two earlier versions. And then we have shoujo manga who aimed at literary realism. Because, of course, what I have shown you right now is cinematic realism. And shoujo aimed for literary realism, and this means that they produced multi-layered pages and used a lot of words, a lot of overlaying panels, and here you have indeterminacy of the frame with actual example. So, for example, you just can go from 1 to 3, 4, 5, and so on. You can just read a page into one whole. This allowed creators of shoujo manga to create these special moods, to get into interiority of characters, to just make a reader stop, because the readers were perplexed by these complicated pages, to just stop and contemplate the interiority of characters, which also produced the realistic effect. And again, this clear distinction was evident in 70s, for example, still remained in 80s. But after 2000, the situation changes. Even in the 90s, actually, it all starts blending together. So in the later titles, you actually find, they're all seinen manga, which is important. They're all seinen. But as you can see, they all have this typical shoujo manga effects. Complicated panel breakdowns, this typical overlaying images of beautiful figures. Even though the aims sometimes are different, and of course in Manga's case you also have these illustrations which cover the whole page and they serve clearly decorative purpose. And also, for example, you find even these versions of beautiful ladies on top of the page, which can be interpreted as moe elements. So it's just for the pleasure of the reader to look at a beautiful woman, a girl. So, just to summarize, there is clear distinction between first two titles and the last two three titles, three adaptations of the Count of Monte Cristo, even not on the level of narrative. I just noticed I never covered the level of narrative, but even on the level of expression. And you can find much more freedom in the later free mangas. Much more switching between different styles, techniques, and so on. So my interpretation of this is that Arte, Kara, became free from narrative in the late 80s. It also meant more freedom for creators. They weren't bound anymore to this set of conventions, for example, associated with shoujo manga or associated with male readership-oriented manga, and instead they were free to just mix it as they wanted, which led to production of these three works. And I'm sorry, it took quite a bit of time, and I just hope you're not too bored. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Olya. Our next speaker is going to be Lisa Koski, curator